For those of you who are just joining, welcome. And I'd like to introduce today's presenter. So Alex DeWitt is a technologist, entrepreneur, big kid, dreamer, father, husband, musician, programmer, Drupaler, lifelong learner, blockchain advocate, and founder of Therefore, a digital agency based in Toronto. And I list those things in no particular order. Alex has got a really great presentation today. We're really excited to see it. We hope that you all enjoy it as well. And take it away, Alex.
Hey, thank you for that introduction. Everyone can hear me, I hope. Yeah, so AKA super busy, right? With all those things. So yeah, today we've got what I hope is an interesting presentation. I've been operating it's not really a Drupal shop. It used to be a Drupal shop. Now more of it's a UX-driven digital agency, but predominantly using Drupal for the better part of 15 years. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on Drupal because I don't think everyone in the audience is really going to be up to date on where Drupal fits in today. I think there's some questions around that, so we'll go through a primer there and a live demo. We'll see how that works. And then we're going to go through the heart of this presentation, so the journey to Jamstack. And then I'll give you a little bit of an update from the last presentation that I did last year in San Fran on Jamstack and Drupal and a fairly large, an at-scale example of Jamstack with Drupal for an e-commerce client, a major grocery store here in Toronto. By the way, I'm in Toronto right now. And then we'll cap it off with a bit of an outlook and our role as web developers and all that good stuff. Okay, so let's start with the Drupal primer. So Drupal 8 is not your granddaddy CMS. Okay, a lot of people, they have an idea that because Drupal's been around for a very long time, Drupal is, an old or maybe outdated or not innovative, and that's really not the case. Drupal is a modern CMS platform. It's open source, and it's one of the only enterprise open source CMSs out there. With Drupal 8, it's a API first CMS. So that's a very important thing. The way that Drupal is architected and thought about is with less bias towards building a website. And it can very well be used as a data store and not even service a website at all. It has interfaces for REST, JSON API, GraphQL, and also the way it's architected is very atomic and data model driven. So when we're building Drupal sites, this is one of the first things that we're thinking about is what is that data model? What are the relationships, the entities, the content types, the fields that define the solution that we're building? And so, Drupal is much more of a CMS framework than it is a web publishing system. And that's one of the reasons why Drupal, in our opinion, fits really well with a Jamstack construct as part of the data channels that go into a Jamstack. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of this innovation of recently, specifically Drupal 8, is that it has this philosophy of found elsewhere. So a lot of platforms, they build their own system, and it's redundant, and there's probably a solution elsewhere that's been built, but with Drupal, it's different. We're looking for things like a Symfony framework. And Drupal adopted the Symfony framework, and there's another, community that's supporting that, and there's many other communities that also use Symfony framework, and that's a smart thing to do. Twig, for instance, is used by many organizations and many software solutions, and Drupal adopted that as well. So it makes sense, and it helps in terms of segmentation of concentration, so that the people who are part of the core team contributing to Drupal really get to concentrate on that CMS effort versus building some of the basics. Yeah, so the word Drupal is actually a Flemish word for village. I actually speak Flemish. I'm from Belgium. So the correct pronunciation, in case anyone's wondering, for Drupal is Drupal. Okay, and one of the really nice things about the Drupal community is that it really is a global community. What I've listed here is some of the call signs. So come for the code, stay for the community. This is a real thing within Drupal. And these are some of the values that are listed on .org. So prioritize impact. That means that, you know, we want to build software that's accessible. We want to build software that's safe for everyone to use. So it's innately secure, and that's easy for people to use. Better together. You know, we want to foster within the Drupal community a learning environment, collaborative decision-making, strive for excellence, constantly reevaluating the decisions that have been made. Are they still relevant? Treat each other with dignity and respect. Community doesn't tolerate intolerance towards others. You know, there's this mutual respect and constructive criticism if something isn't aligned. And then last but certainly not least, and very much represented by DrupalCons, enjoy what you do. You know, if you've ever been part of a DrupalCon, it's a really fun event. And, you know, although Drupal services a lot of enterprise, doesn't mean that we can't have fun doing that. Okay. So who uses Drupal? All right, 7% of the world's top sites use and trust Drupal. So these are some of the examples. These are not small sites. And the ones that I picked here, I tried to give an example of various different kinds of organizations that use Drupal. So everything from Tesla to large telecom, to social, to education, science, and Lady Gaga, right? So it crosses all the spans. Okay, so why organizations love Drupal? Okay, so it's, you know, organizations love the fact that there's lots of integrations with MarTech. There's lots of integrations with all sorts of other systems. Some of these integrations are built by those third-party organizations. Some of them are built by the community. Drupal has a great track record of security. Out of the box, it addresses, you know, the top 10 OWASP issues. There's brute force mitigation, DB encryption options. There's a dedicated security team. Great reporting and governance. So if you want to build a content development workflow, Drupal is really strong at doing that. And there's a huge community of talented, experienced developers that organizations can rely upon. Why content editors love Drupal? Okay, so of course you got the WYSIWYGs and things like that. That's not special, but you have a lot of flexibility in how you build that content experience. You know, it's quite possible to fully customize those workflows, to make them task-based, to make them role-based. You know, having certain roles have access to certain functionality versus others. There's a lot of flexibility that, you know, given the time and concentration on the agency side, we can really cater it to a great content editing and management experience. Of course, multilingual is there from the very first versions of Drupal. Being built in Belgium, there's actually 3 official languages in Belgium, so it only made sense in Europe to build it from the core with multilingual capabilities. And then content as a service. You know, for instance, multilingual, let's say you want to have an external content translator. There are systems in place with Drupal. It's not too difficult to have the content translation services be part of that content authoring workflow and that governance model. And then lastly, why do developers love Drupal? And there's probably a few people scratching their heads because, you know, out there there's mixed feelings around that. And I think part of that is because Drupal is difficult initially for a developer. There's a certain learning curve that has to be accomplished before you can actually use it effectively. So that's part of it. And, you know, if you shortcut that, then there's complications. But if you don't shortcut that, you really understand how Drupal works. It's actually a very powerful enterprise-ready open platform CMS, and there's, you know, not a lot of reasons to not consider Drupal. Okay, so now that I've given a little bit of a sales pitch about Drupal, let's have a look at the actual an actual example of Drupal. Okay, so this is a demo site, and what I'm going to show you, more of a traditional way of editing within Drupal. So you've got basically preparation time for this recipe, and you've got some type ahead, and you've got an image, WYSIWYG, pretty standard fare. There's nothing really special about this, some drag and drop and blah, blah, blah. But where it gets more interesting is if we go to view, we can do interesting things like this. We can go quick edit. And we can actually say, let's say I want to quick edit this section here. When life throws you a curve ball, a wholesome pasta bake is the ultimate comfort food. Okay, so that was really quick, and this is nice for, and that's saved, that's live now. There wasn't any builds, and these are one of the things that's pretty cool about a monolith. Not saying that everything is cool about a monolith, and we're going to get into that, but this is a cool feature. Another kind of cool feature that's difficult to do, but not difficult within a monolith, is, let's say I wanted to change some of these things. So the layout of the page, I wanted to move the number of servings. Let's say we did A/B testing, and we decided, you know what, it makes sense for us to actually have the difficulty in the bottom right and the number of servings in the bottom left. And it showed better in our A/B test, so we're going to make that change. It's that simple. You can just drag and drop. And perhaps we want to add, a new section. We can add a new section, a 2-column section, 3-column section. Add the section. Then we can start adding blocks here. So we've got this nice page building option, and we can build this out to various degrees. So we can have certain sections of the page be static, where you can only fill out the content based on a form. But we can have all of these components, and we can drag and drop these components in and really customize the layouts. Okay, so that's a quick demo of Drupal. Obviously, there's a lot more, but it gives you an idea there. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of a foundation of what Drupal is, what it can do, kind of the cool things that that happen that you can do if you're dealing with a tightly integrated system between the front and the back. Let's go through our journey from more traditional Drupal stack, which is what you just saw, all the way out to the Jamstack. Okay, so traditional stack, we basically have Drupal, and Drupal is taking care of the front end. Okay, so some of the concerns around this, though, is that when you're working within Drupal, it's quite a highly opinionated approach as to how we build for the web. And there's issues with that, right? So you've got this idea or this concept of a Drupal developer. And outside of Drupal, maybe they're a little bit shorthanded in terms of maybe they've forgotten how to build, for the web outside of Drupal. And that's a real thing, right? You start building within this ecosystem, and you start becoming a Drupal web developer versus a web developer. One cool thing is, of course, you have complete control over the presentation and data layers when you're working in this structure. Orgs and devs, they get a lot of features out of the box. You don't have to search. There's a lot of vetted features in modules and in Drupal core itself. But then, it can be quite fragile. You have everything within the same system. MySQL decides to have, a day, and it's good night for your site, unless there's other mitigation factors in place, but these can get complex. It's also quite expensive to scale. It's not unheard of for Drupal sites to be in the tens of thousands of dollars per month for hosting, even for sites that are not global reach with massive amounts of traffic. It can get expensive to scale. And specifically if you have a lot of logged in sessions concurrently. And security and performance, of course, is always important to monitor these things, but they need to be closely monitored with Drupal. You have a You have a monolith that has a lot of moving parts, probably 10 million plus lines of code. I'm not sure exactly how many, but last time I checked, it was in the millions. So that's a fairly substantial footprint to monitor. Okay, so that's our traditional CMS stack. Lots of advantages, but there's baggage that comes along with it. So the next thing that we looked at as an agency is progressive decoupled Drupal. Okay, so where the traditional stack gives you full control and it's all within Drupal, progressive decoupled is a recognition that there are certain things that are done better with JavaScript rendering. So for instance, if you have a financial chart, there are a lot of libraries out in the web where you have incredible charting solutions that are built on JavaScript. It's very dynamic, it works really well. So we want some of that within Drupal. Okay, so that's an option. With progressive decoupling, we can say, okay, well, we're gonna have an embedded layer of JavaScript framework, let's say React, and those components, so in this particular case, the charts, are going to be communicating with Drupal's API as though it's a decoupled system, but it's still partially decoupled. It's progressive. So if you think about a dial, you know, if we're just doing one component on a page, the dial is a little bit askew from all the way over the left, but we could even go further to the middle or to the right by saying, okay, well, instead of just a single component, let's have 80% of the page be rendered with this JavaScript framework. And that is possible as well. So now you have this concept of progressively decoupled. So we're not going all the way and completely decoupled, we're progressively decoupled, okay? It's quite a popular way of approaching things. And for a lot of sites, it makes sense to do that. Okay. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, so fully on the right side, we have fully decoupled Drupal. Okay, full separation of concerns between the presentation layer and the CMS. The CMS is essentially only a data provider. Of course, it's also a CMS, allows you to manage content and the workflows and the governance of that content. And there's lots of good things that can happen there, but it's all concentrated around being a data provider, okay? And then, yeah, things like in-place editing, layout management that I showed you earlier in the demo isn't really an option with fully decoupled. And I know there's certain ways that are being developed right now to handle that on the front end, but you know, it's not quite there yet, and certainly not at the level that we have with a fully coupled system. But you know, with a fully decoupled, you've got greater control and responsibility for the front end devs, which is a good thing. Like if you know what you're doing and you want to take care of all the accessibility and the, you know, all of the things that Drupal sometimes takes care of you, at least to a certain degree, on the front end, and you want to do them on your own, you can absolutely do that. And with a fully decoupled system, it is now your responsibility fully. Okay. And some of these things really make, like if you're doing a native app, obviously this is the way to go. Okay, so now we finally get to the stack. That is the Jamstack. Okay, so it's pretty much identical to the fully decoupled, with the difference being that we have a static file generator, and now we have a workflow that is being managed by yours truly, or not yours truly, but Netlify. Yeah, so all the front end templates separate from Drupal. Drupal has nothing to do with them. They live within the static file generator. So in our case, we used React templates with Gatsby, and feeding into that Netlify workflow for to host everything on a CDN. And then the API is being used only for real-time data needs. The API is, you know, also being used obviously for generating the static files and the content within the static files, but after that, it's only being used for real-time data needs. Okay, and as most of you, I would presume, know, the stack security and performance is by design. You know, you're hitting the CDN. You're only hitting the API for real time. It's great for performance. Static files, there is no bootstrap. It's super fast. It's, you know, it's the way to go in many ways when security and performance is the largest consideration. Okay, so we have built with all of these stacks. A lot of the stacks that we build with, or a lot of the projects that we build today are still on the traditional Drupal stack. Many times it makes sense, and the majority of sites on the web right now, their CMS sites still build with that stack. But there's a strong argument now to start to move either to progressive decoupling or to move to fully decoupled static sites. And as of recently, there's been further progressions as well to allow for partial builds, which pushes the needle forward. And the next slide I want to show you is kind of our vision, and we're working towards this, and there's a few other organizations are working towards this as well, our vision of kind of a have your cake and eat it too scenario. Okay, so we're calling this progressive static sites. And basically what this would mean is on the Drupal side, now we have the layout builder and we have that inside out editing. So that stays in Drupal. And the content editors, they love that functionality. On the static file generator side, we have our web components. And that works exactly the same way as the previous slide with the Jamstack. So we're generating those components. Okay, and we have this library of static components that interact with the API. So now if you can imagine a scenario where a content manager or content editor is going to the Drupal, they load up the preview site, and within the preview site they have access to those static components. Okay, the static components, just like on the live site, we'll use the API in the preview scenario, and they can drag and drop and build their layouts. Okay, this is a powerful thing. They could even potentially do outside-in editing within the Drupal environment for those statically generated components. And when they're ready to publish, okay, so they've been previewing, when they're ready to publish, Drupal acts like a static site generator, generating that layout from the pre-generated components, and then generating the actual full page to be hosted on Netlify through that workflow. So this is, this is what we're working towards. We would love to have this in place, and we're getting there, and there's other organizations that are looking at this as well. So I believe it's still true to the Jamstack philosophy. Maybe there's some arguments there. Maybe we can do, have a Q&A around that. But yeah, that's kind of our North Star. So obviously we have a lot of decisions to make. When you're looking at a project and you're trying to decide, do we build it as tightly coupled? Do we build it as decoupled, progressive decoupled, maybe Jamstack, maybe progressive static, So there's this handy decision matrix that you can find on Dries. It's Dries, but dri.es. Dries is the CTO of the Drupal project. And I want to walk you through the decision process that we made when deciding to go with Jamstack for Longos, which is that grocery store that I mentioned earlier. So the first question we asked ourselves is do we have multiple experiences? And we knew that we were going to be building a website, and then we were going to follow that up with a mobile app. So yes, we had multiple experiences. Is one of them a web application? Absolutely. Then, do developers need to have control over visual presentation instead of editors? Yes, we do. And the editors, the way that they're operating, they have a lot of different data sources in behind the scenes. So data is combined. It's concentrated at an API layer and then applied to the static layout. So it made sense that we didn't need just one CMS to control all of the content that gets displayed within the output, right, within the renders. So anyhow, I don't want to go through each one of these. You can see the slide here. But where we ended up with is a combination of two. We needed a fully decoupled app, and we needed a Jamstack decoupled static site. So we launched the static site. You can see it at longos.com. We launched that last year, late last year, and then recently we also launched the mobile app, and it's pretty cool. It's a good example of Jamstack at scale. It has e-commerce. It has manages login states. You know, the whole project was run very agile, and the Jamstack really helped with that, being able to work with their team closely. So yeah, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into the mobile. Okay, so how therefore delivered Longo's mobile app on the Jamstack faster, cheaper, and better. I said it right. The iron triangle. So yeah, basically the summary is that Longo saved months of development and considerable cost by repurposing about 70% of the existing Jamstack website for the mobile app. This is not insignificant, right? And it was part of the bigger plan as well, is we would build out the site, and knowing that a lot of these components that we're building, we wanted to have these reused on the mobile. Okay, so some of the goals for this project is repurpose as much as possible, right? Deliver in record time, the mobile specifically. Publish to both Apple and Android stores at the same time. Maintain that brand and UX consistency. Obviously, if we're using a lot of the same components, that goes a long way towards that. But they still want to centrally control the content through Drupal CMS. So the messaging that goes to the app, that goes to the site, they wanted that centralized control. In fact, today we're talking about expanding that centralized messaging control to some of their other properties as well. And they wanted, you know, one upstream, wanted two workflows and two separate endpoints. So Netlify became, you know, a critical component of that want as well. Okay, so the launch was very successful, and it took 2.5 months to launch the site, or sorry, to launch the mobile app on both stores. They were both accepted within days of submission, which is great. There were no changes that we had to make. So yeah, overall the launch was very successful as well. And looking forward, there's some, you know, ideas. So, you know, especially today in this climate and the economy and, you know, things that are going on with the disease, you know, things are moving to the home. So some ideas for Longos, some ideas for how to carry this further: foster food culture at home, make grocery shopping a shared experience, trace your meal with blockchain. So can you imagine, you know, you've got a grocery order, QR code, and you can find out exactly what that journey was for those, you know, for whatever it is, that loaf of bread. Learn how to cook at home videos, touchless delivery. You know, the ideas are endless. And in each case, what we need, you know, pick the right stacks, pick the right technologies to be able to move fast and to move securely and build high performance agile solutions. Okay, so kind of wrapping up, the outlook: digital has become an essential service. I think that's pretty obvious, especially working with a grocer recently on these projects. You know, and we have a responsibility as digital professionals as well to deliver best of breed solutions to the people and organizations that need us more than ever. You know, we have to get to market quick with the right stack. We have to simplify and focus on the problems to solve. We don't have time to create, you know, huge BRDs and take months of we've got needs today that we have to solve. So focus on those problems to solve is a good plan. And with Jamstack, you know, that big part of that is being able to segment areas of concern, allowing us to focus. Embrace and promote agility to align to changing needs. That's a pretty obvious one. Another obvious one, but it can get lost in the rush, is great UX is the key to rapid and sustained adoption, right? And then lastly, but not least, think digital but act human. So there you go. I kind of rifled through that, half an hour. Actually, that's not too bad. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I've got somebody from my team that's going to join in to help with some of the maybe more hardcore questions on the tech side. So his name is Homer. And yeah, so maybe we can open up the floor. And I see there's some questions here. Hopefully we don't get Zoom bombed by my cat. It's at the door. Okay. I'm just going to read a few questions here, okay? Okay, so there's one here from Alberto Silva, okay? How do you export data from Drupal to feed the static generator? If you are using Gatsby, do you use Gatsby source Drupal plugin? Okay, so yes, we're using Gatsby. This is a bit of, you probably use Homer to give a little bit more of a detailed response. So Homer, can you answer that question for us? A little bit more detail than I can provide.
I think we need to unmute him. Let me find him here. I actually cannot find him in here. So maybe grab another one while I find him in here. So
sure thing. Okay.
Oh, right. We got him. We're good.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I found another good question, but we'll do that one afterwards.
Yeah. Can you hear me? All good?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Thanks for that. So, Alberto, yes, regarding your question, we were based on the Gatsby source Drupal plugin. Out of the box, it's a very good support for what Drupal 8.5, I think it was, that the JSON API came into core, and this plugin ties right into that. So out of the box, you can jump into Drupal, get the data you need, and work with Gatsby's GraphQL quite easily. So.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so we have another question here. How do you handle content editing previews in a fully decoupled stack or sharing drafts for approval? Right, so this is the big problem, right? Because when you're fully decoupled, in the traditional sense, your previews within Drupal CMS don't apply because Drupal is just being used as a data store. Now, you can of course have separate environments on the Netlify platform, one for previewing and then do the build and preview your content there. But you have to go through the build process, and that takes time, obviously, to go through the build, depending on how complicated the site is and how many, well, basically how complicated it is. But very recently, and maybe Drupal or maybe Homer, you want to give a little bit more information about the partial builds that are now possible. That should mitigate the time for those builds to allow for those builds to be, or those preview builds to be faster. Homer, can you give a little bit more insight into that? Because it's fairly fresh information.
Certainly. The first thing I want to say is about Netlify and the benefit of how easy it is to have different versions of the site running, right? In the longest project in particular, we had a very specific condition where there was a certain amount of sites on a staging API, and then a certain number of sites which we had to work out to run against a production API. And it gave the client an opportunity to be able to preview, the site in different states against these different APIs before ever bringing them to the public. And that's something with Netlify and the builds And working against that, we're able to flush out very well and be very effective. And yes, as Alex mentioned, the Gatsby in particular incremental builds is something that's very fresh. And there's a recent blog on Netlify themselves describing how you can start experimenting with it to start seeing how it can affect your builds and improve those processes and workflows. So, you know, having things like that in place can turn what were previews and could take, you know, a couple minutes to run depending on the size of your sites, to going down to, you know, like maybe 30 seconds for them to get a preview. But, you know, there's another aspect that we try and educate clients on around that, is getting away from this instant gratification of the preview publish. And that's another feature of Netlify, which we've greatly leveraged, that disabling auto publishing prevents, you know, new content, even on builds, from instantly going to the public, so that there's always a chance to stop, preview the content, view, and then within seconds publish that version of the site once you're happy. So
great. And we've got a couple of questions here that are basically the same thing. So what was the mobile development? Was it native or hybrid? What framework did you use? So we used React Native. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into this. And Homer, in terms of the interplay between the components that were built on the web versus the components that are on the mobile, can we talk a little bit about some of the efficiencies between you know, what we could reuse or what had to be modified to allow for the, you know, that mobile component reuse?
sure thing. So yes, we did use React Native, and we're actually using a mono repo for the website, the .com, and the website that's hosting the mobile app content. So with React Native, we're using a web frame to render a Gatsby site on Netlify, and through, again, the build process on Netlify to differentiate which version of the site is being built from this mono repo, that helps establish how the site gets formed between one project or the other. And as the actual components themselves, you know, there's some balance in understanding where components become completely unique against the native environment, because it gets very specific, especially like the navigation handling and such, versus some page elements, which I think some of the pages could leverage the exact mobile responsive components right from the .com, and we had very little effort. Whereas, you know, some, and depending on the flows, is where we started to differentiate a little, but still, you know, finding everything we could to leverage from the existing components, and again, reduce effort in repeating ourselves. So
Great, thanks. So can the same info apply to WordPress? So we're less familiar with WordPress, but WordPress certainly does have an API layer. Don't believe it's as robust as what we can do with Drupal, and the data modeling capabilities of Drupal compared to WordPress are probably another differentiation. But I think in principle, depending on how complex your needs are, you can apply the same stack. So if you wanted to do a Jamstack and have WordPress be a data store for your Jamstack, absolutely, you could certainly do that. The questions are more now that you should be asking yourself are, since we're removing the front end modules that are, and the front end capabilities in WordPress, is WordPress still the right solution for specifically content management and building that great experience and having the flexibility for the data model that's required for this organization, not only today, but like, you know, in the future? And if the answer is yes, I think there's, you know, API apart, like in terms of like how well the data is structured. I think WordPress would be a fine solution for a lot of different applications. Sean, if you've got anything to add to that, go ahead. But I think that's probably how I would approach it.
that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know much about Drupal hosting. Where do you host the Drupal site for Longos? Right. So the Longos site is with Pantheon. So that's pantheon.io. We've been working with Pantheon for forever and a day. Great organization. They have a, it's a PaaS solution, so it's not just a cloud server. It's a full platform that manages the Git and the, we've got different staging environments, blah, blah, blah. So it serves as the upstream to Netlify. And, when we were working with Longos, it was really a collaborative effort between building and hosting the CMS solution on Pantheon, and then working with Netlify to ensure that the upstream is working seamlessly between the two environments. Okay, we've got a lot of questions. 36. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them. 1 second here.
Yeah, feel free to grab the ones that you can, and for the rest of them, we'll try to provide a response afterwards. So.
Yeah. Some of these, like, what are your go-to Drupal modules to install? That's a bigger question. Maybe we can answer that one afterwards. Okay, so here's an interesting one. Did you do any kind of performance benchmarking before moving to Jam and after? Okay, so on a specific site, no. So like the Longo site, no, because the previous site was built with .NET and it was just awful. So, well, we did do some performance testing, but we knew it was going to be night and day between the two. So I think what you're probably asking is, compared to, let's say, a Drupal site, and if we were to build it out the same site as a Jamstack solution. So we have to look at that as a general. So generally the Drupal sites that we build, because we have some fairly substantial infrastructure to support those sites, the performance is quite good. So even the demo site that you saw there wasn't any noticeable performance issues. Now, mind you, that's not getting hit. It's only being hit by myself, but you can see it's quite snappy. And in general, because of all the caching layers that are implemented for Drupal within these, an Acquia or a platform.sh or Pantheon, it's going to be fairly performant. The problem is there's a cost associated with that, and there's also a cost of scaling that. Whereas if you're on a Jamstack, you get immediate by design performance, and the scalability is far easier in many cases than what you would have through scaling Drupal to those levels. So hopefully that answers that question, at least somewhat. Okay.
If I can just add one thing to that, Alex?
Sure. Yeah.
Just to be very considerate, with great power comes great responsibility. So by putting everything in the front end now, there is more onus on us as front end developers to really be considerate of how performant some of our code works. And things like Gatsby, they have lots of plugins and great integrations to Netlify already, but you still have to kind of pick and choose some things and pay attention to it, because while the performance is out of the box and the power of the CDN with Netlify is good, you're not going to get all those benefits if some of the code starts to slow down if you're not careful still. So just always something to be considerate of. And previously it's something that did sit more on that full stack and was kind of pushed off to the backend developers, and the front end could just do what they did, but you actually have to be very active and thoughtful in that as you work now. So.
Guys, these are great questions. I was just scanning through them. This is great. I wish we had all day to go through these. Okay, so if you have to pick between Django and Drupal, would it still be Drupal? I got to be honest. I don't know. I don't know the difference between Django and Drupal. Maybe I should look into that. It's kind of what I was talking about, like the Drupal ecosystem. We kind of dive into it, and sometimes it's hard to see out of it. So maybe somebody else can answer that question for me that's more familiar with the two. Okay, the next one. In your progressive stack site approach, or the fully decoupled approach, is this somewhere that Acquia cohesion could work? Well, it could. It depends on the level of access that you have to cohesion and the ability to modify it, because the idea with this decoupled static approach would, or sorry, progressive decoupled static approach, I forget what I call it, but you know what I mean, is the idea that the layouts, right, this configuration would be pushed out as part of that static build. So in theory, because cohesion uses what's called paragraphs in Drupal, there's positioning metadata that could be generated, and that positioning metadata could be used to have those dynamic layout builds on the static site generator. So in theory, yes, I think that would work. But in practice, it depends on the level of access that you would have to cohesion itself to manipulate it to capture that information and have that be part of that static build workflow. How to use Jamstack for Drupal 7. So we have done it in the past. We did not have the same kind of tools that we have today. There was no Netlify at the time when we did it. And we were using a different static site generator. What was it called again, Homer? Remember the name of it?
Oh, DocPad.
That's it. We have a dartpad. Yes, dartboard somewhere with DocPad written on it. Yeah, so we've tried it with Drupal 7. Honestly, like my recommendation would be to not use Drupal 7 for decoupled solutions because Drupal 8 is quite mature. It released in November 2017. Unless you're thinking about mitigating some of the costs for a Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migration, which is something that we've been thinking about as well for those Drupal 7 sites that someone's invested perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars and now they have to upgrade to Drupal 8 and it's going to be essentially a rebuild. Is there another way? So, and then the thought would be, well, let's tuck Drupal 7, the CMS experience, behind a firewall, make it something that's internally accessible only for content management, and have a Jamstack in front of it. Very viable approach, right? We haven't had the opportunity to do this yet, but Homer, like, if we had to do it like that, what are some of the ideas that you would think about? I know there's modules for RESTful API services against Drupal 7. Maybe that's the first step. Maybe there's some progression there as well, where GraphQL is an option for D7. Ideas?
Yeah, I haven't looked into it recently, but REST out of the box, you can have a way to connect Gatsby and other Jamstack sites against it, because the whole point of Jamstack is it's free, right? The idea that we can use any data source or multiple data sources that make sense to point to whatever build you're working on. And as Alex mentioned, like Drupal 7, that, if you lock down, protect, VPN, private access Drupal 7, and there's no more security risk, but it's a secure API connection to Netlify or some kind of interim gateway that then Netlify gets to, you still let them use that system and find a way to transition. And there's even the chance that you can start with part of the site and start chopping off, like maybe you start with the article section. So that becomes dynamic and it's on Netlify, that it looks like it's under the main site. And as far as I know, Netlify does some pretty interesting things with the redirects, that you can go to a site and it can be another site. I haven't fully experimented with it, but there's some handy things you can do there to be able to serve part of the site from Netlify that isn't on Netlify while serving the parts that are, and pick and choose and start to migrate the site slowly that way. So.
Yeah. All right. Can we use Angular with Drupal? Sure, why not? We used to use Angular. We built a few sites with Angular and Drupal. Same kind of concept as React. We prefer React. Can you export from Drupal in raw JSON? My understanding is absolutely, but Homer, if you've got some further details. around that? There's JSON API, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once you have a data source, you should be able to work with it with any framework, right? And another aspect that we found beneficial in Netlify is being able to protect the connection, right? So with just a simple config inside the repository. And there's environment variables that you can have on your projects to help further secure and protect your build. So if whatever stack you're using has some different needs, there's probably a way that you can tap into it as needed. So.
Okay. What about GraphQL support? So Drupal 8 has GraphQL support. About real-time previews using Gatsby and Drupal. Okay, so I think we probably cover the real-time previews, but yeah, Drupal also has GraphQL support. It's being put into core. I'm not sure if it's in core yet in 8.7. Homer, do you know if it's in core yet? I know that's part of the roadmap though.
Not yet, but the Drupal 8 GraphQL, we've seen some success with it, and it's another option and flavor that you could have the benefit of JSON API for some things and GraphQL for other things, right? You can really just start to mix and match, but definitely having used Gatsby and understanding the benefits of GraphQL, I do see that becoming a much more prominent tool in the future. And when you can get past the hurdle and your brain can kind of comprehend all the capabilities, and you can actually start providing custom GraphQL endpoints and exposing that as you need to suit your needs, yeah, definitely going to see a lot of great things come from that.
Cool. Are images files served directly from Drupal servers, or are they hosted on a CDN Netlify portion? Okay, so I'm assuming that you're talking about decoupled or Jamstack, or progressive Jamstack. So in all of those cases, they are hosted on Netlify. We're not hitting the Drupal site. So with Longos, for instance, if you go to longos.com or the app, you won't see any indication that there's Drupal in the mix whatsoever. Drupal's nicely tucked away, safe, and away from prying eyes. And all of the files are being hosted from the CDN. Okay. Got a link that someone sent through, Ryan, for Gatsby JS org packages, Gatsby-source-Drupal. Maybe what I'll just do is I'll send that out to check it out. Okay, so there you go. Just wrote check it out as the answer. So if anyone else wants to check out that link. Right. What are some of the advantages of using Drupal over another enterprise content management platform? Did the client already have experience with Drupal, and that's why you chose Drupal as the backend? So the client did not have experience with Drupal. In many cases, why Drupal is chosen is because it's one of the only platforms that's enterprise open source. It's quite appealing. The limitations are often on other systems, not on the Drupal side. Some of the hesitation for using Drupal is because it's open source as well. People still have, I'm going to say, more traditional way of looking at it and thinking, oh, security is an issue with open source, blah, blah, blah. And this really falls flat, right? If you have concern about open source, then turn off your browser. 90% of what you're using on the web is open source, right? So that argue falls short. So at this point in time, Drupal is really well positioned. Open source, enterprise ready CMS, lots of organizations use it because they need that level of governance. They need that level of assurance that the platform that they're using is tried, tested, and true, right? So that's one of the reasons why we like Drupal as well. We've been working with it for over 12 years. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Have you looked into Gatsby recipes? At Amazing Labs, we're thinking it could become, so Amazing Lab, you guys are awesome. We're big fans. Hey, Homer, do you see that question there?
I don't think so.
No? Okay. So have you looked into Gatsby recipes? At Amazing Labs, we're thinking it could become something larger than Gatsby, and as such, bootstrapping a full Drupal website, installing required modules, Composer, Require, and Drush Enable, and setting up Gatsby front end, all while teaching the end user each step. Is that about that? Remember, I sent through the link in GitHub about the project that those guys were doing. Is that relating to that?
So Amazing Labs is doing some great work on this front, as well Emulsify, which is by Four Kitchens. They're both kind of looking at Drupal and seeing, you know, the benefits of Gatsby and how that can play into building a site. But some of the aspects that I've seen so far, it's still potentially building static alongside the Drupal theme. But yeah, that, as Alex was covering in the slides, the progressive static site approach that he had covered, I think is in the vein where Amazing Labs is trying to move towards, where, you know, you're building one theme of components, right? And they're all in whatever, if it's Gatsby, you know, that's the goal. It's all in React, and the admins can interact with that on the back end while they're doing their previews, changing content, but there's still somewhere that you can then push it and it will know how to render it, right? So yeah, definitely very interested, but specifically recipes is not something I've looked at. I know Gatsby themes and kind of the approach with that, and had some mixed interactions with how that works right now. But yeah, definitely following along with Amazing Labs and their work on that. So
cool. Okay, what are your build times like? How are you handling image styling and processing? Drupal doing that, Gatsby doing that, or something else? Homer, you want to answer that one? Build times?
So the build times, you know, we've worked with Netlify quite a bit to work on different aspects to improve and maximize builds. And the Netlify build plugin, which is coming through and still in beta, has some optimizations to start caching Gatsby beyond, you know, what comes out of the box. And I've also experimented with some of this on my own to specifically for this project to kind of push things, but I've also been working closely with Netlify to help, you know, identify some things where they might be able to change and help improve builds for everyone using Netlify, because, you know, we see if it's a problem we're having, there's probably other people who might be able to benefit from changes and improvements, right? But yeah, with the large amount of content that's going through there, you know, the average build is around 10 to 15 minutes right now, but we haven't started experimenting with the incremental builds as of yet. And that's our next goal, to start looking at that. But the benefit of caching and why it's important with a Gatsby site, on not just Netlify, but any service you want to use, is that, you know, when you're building the Gatsby site, if that cache folder is not kept, the images in particular are one of the largest, most taxing aspects of the build. And you need that cache folder to make sure that you're actually getting those subsequent builds to ignore images that you've processed. Changed images, new images, absolutely. But the last thing you want to do is go through, you know, 10,000 images over and over every build. So that's one of the aspects that we're seeing, you know, the benefit of by caching that on Netlify. So,
okay, I'm gonna do one more question here because we're at the 1 hour mark. I think this one's a good one to end on. So from Kaleem, why use Netlify at all? Is the Drupal site being hosted behind a firewall? So let me answer the second question first. Yes, the Drupal site is being hosted behind a firewall. In fact, we can limit the access to the Drupal site to you know, even a specific IP, or we can build a tunnel between Pantheon and the organization. I think that's actually what we did in Longo's case, and Homer, you can tell me if that's incorrect, but we certainly did explore that. And then also, why use Netlify at all? So I think it's it's prudent that we discuss the build process from a high level to answer that question, right? Because Netlify is quite a critical component to the workflow here. Homer, can you address those? So first of all, just validate that that we have that tunnel, and then just talk about the build process between the Drupal API and the Netlify build.
Sure, I'll try to be as prompt as I can.
Yeah, thanks.
So the Drupal side, yes, behind a firewall, we're able to connect directly to a gateway service when the client manages, and they're basically the gatekeeper for any traffic coming in or out of Drupal, beyond the protected users and IPs through VPN that actually access Drupal. And that's one of the security aspects that Alex mentioned, and similar to the Drupal 7 example we gave, where you could still technically run Drupal 7, in the right place without actually exposing it. As far as Netlify, there's many benefits, and if you haven't played with it, definitely recommend giving it a try. For like personal projects, the free tier and what they offer is just fabulous, that you can play around and do the things you can. But the benefits we've seen in running the higher level tiers in the build speed and the aspect of the workflow in something like Gatsby, because with Longos we had different gateways, so different branches or different sites on Netlify have to build a certain way against certain APIs, and there was a lot of play into understanding how this mix came together. And anytime we needed a new feature to spin up and dedicate some time to, you can do quite easily. And if you have connected with GitHub, they even allow the ability to auto build PRs. So as soon as your development team is building PRs for you, you can wait, see the preview URL, click on it, actually look at their changes, and you get away from this workflow of managing developers, of having to pull changes locally, change out your local environment, look at the changes after a build, and kind of like get back and forth. That's something that Netlify is pushed to get working very well, and it's very handy feature to be able to just look at a preview branch, assess the code, and be able to get to responses faster on PRs. So that's the best I can do in a short time.
Well, cool. I couldn't have done it better myself. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps things up. We've got like 41 other questions. Nate, maybe you can give some direction in terms of like if there's anything follow up to answer some of those questions. But yeah,
Sure.
We had fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex and Sean. It was really, really helpful, and hopefully everybody got a lot out of it. As you mentioned, there are a bunch of questions. We'll get to as many offline as we can. And again, we will be sharing this presentation, a recording of this presentation afterwards. But thank you everybody for attending. Thank you again, Alex and Sean, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.